Hi, I'm Alanis Morissette, and welcome to Conversation with Alanis Morissette. Today's guest is Nina W. Brown. Nina is a professor and eminent scholar of counseling at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. She is the former president of the Society of Group Psychology and Group Psychotherapy and a current commissioner for the American Psychological Association's Commission on Accreditation. Nina Brown is the author of 27 books on group therapy and narcissism, including Children of the Self-Absorbed, Loving the Self-Absorbed, Whose Life Is It Anyway, and The Destructive Narcissistic Pattern. Her teachings orient toward supporting people in protecting themselves, letting go of old patterns, and building a new sense of self. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome her to the show today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nina. It's an honor for me to have you on this show. I've been reading your books more than once. I've read almost every one of your books 2 or 3 times, which goes to show that there's a lot that I've had to learn from you about the whole dynamic of the destructive narcissistic pattern of which you've written about and dived deeply into, and as we are hopefully going to do as well today in this conversation. But thank you for being here and joining us. I think it's a really important conversation personally for me, and a conversation that may support a lot of people in clarity around this very heated and challenging topic for relationships.
Well, I want to say first, thank you very much for having me on and for the wonderful introduction. And I'm delighted that anything that I wrote could be of help to someone.
Yes. Well, I can already tell you you've helped me enormously and those whom I love. So thanks for the personal side. And then on the macro side, here we are. So one thing I just wanted to start with is I noticed that unlike some authors and some doctors and teachers around the planet, you refer to what most people would call narcissistic personality disorder. You call it destructive narcissistic pattern. First of all, I appreciate that because it does imply that narcissism is on a continuum, and that in and of itself, it's not a bad word. There can be healthy, developed narcissism that has us function really well as egos with each other relationally. But I just wanted to know how you arrived at that term to begin with. And was it based on narcissism being on a continuum, or I'm just curious?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was. You describe it perfectly. I don't think of it in pejorative terms. Mm-hmm. I like to think of it in terms that, and this is for adults. Mm-hmm. I want to make that clear. We're not talking about children. We're talking about adults. And also, a narcissistic personality disorder is a psychiatric diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And most of the people that we meet, either we can't diagnose them, we shouldn't diagnose them, mm-hmm. they haven't been diagnosed. Mm. And then there's some people, if you think about it, on a continuum. They have some of the behaviors and attitudes that could be reflected of the narcissistic personality disorder, but they don't have all of them, and some of them are not quite as intense.
Right.
And so this is kind of a subclinical description, and I wanted to put it on the basis of behaviors and attitudes, not as a fixed trait.
Not as stamped in the DSM?
I can't go that far, but I'd like to think of it that way.
Yeah, not a stamp, but it's actually a fleshing out. Really, it's a getting really specific, especially, and we'll get there in a few moments if you're up for it. The different kinds of patterns of destructive narcissism too, because the more I've been able to separate them into different kinds, the greater understanding I have of it, and also the greater I can be less susceptible. And so perhaps if you're up for it, I'd love to define what the destructive narcissistic pattern would be on one end of the continuum. Things like extreme self-focus, in some cases grandiosity, a sense of entitlement, a lack of empathy, a sense of someone being an appendage or an extension of self versus an individuated other across from us. On the grandiosity flip side, the impoverished self, attention-seeking behavior, admiration-seeking behavior, a tendency towards shallow emotions, sometimes a sense of being envious, contemptuous, sometimes arrogance, Another theme that I notice is a thread throughout this destructive narcissistic pattern is a sense of emptiness at the core versus loneliness, which we can dive into. Also, as parents, the tendency toward parentification of a child, reversing the nurturing versus instead of giving nurturing to a child, receiving it, which has a interesting effect on children. We can dive into that one. Basking in the child's reflected glory, maybe some vicarious living. Intolerant of a child in particular, but others' sort of values or needs or wants, or lack of consideration or concern for others. A tendency sometimes to exploit others, and a real demand or even need of being seen as unique or special. I mean, unique, I've always really loved the word unique because it implies that we all are, but that sense of wanting to stick out or have the superiority, the better than, worse than thing, which is really disconnected and quite lonely. Am I missing something? I just want to come out with a bang.
I don't think so. I think you went through that very nicely, probably better than I could at this point.
Oh my gosh!
Well, but no, yeah. Those are
indications.
Yeah, that was an effort to try and clarify some of the confusing behaviors and attitudes, because I found that when many people tried to describe a person or a situation where they felt that they were overwhelmed by someone, it's so confusing until they can't make you understand what it was about the person or what the person did or said that was so infuriating and upsetting. And so I tried to separate it out and describe it in a way that perhaps could be a little clearer.
Well, it was very clear. And I also particularly enjoyed and benefited from your separating out, and you can let me know if you've updated this or changed any of the wording, how you separated out the destructive narcissistic pattern into 4 styles or types of patterns. One of them being sort of the hungry or the needy. You've used different words in different teachings of yours, as I've seen. So I'm curious what new words you may use. But the 4 styles that we can dive into is the hungry needy, the approach or behavioral approach of needing attention or complaining or pouting or maybe a version of collapsing. And then secondarily, a suspicious, sort of critical, maybe more fearful and paranoid of being taken advantage of, easily jealous or envious, easily narcissistically wounded. The third one being manipulative, deceptive, a little superiority approach perhaps, entitled, boasts, brags, flatters, charms, sometimes seductive, a tendency toward offloading blame on other people. And then the fourth one, you use the word exhibitionist, or there's probably another word that you used, maybe grandstanding, which is, a lot of very kind of intense and reckless, maybe impulsive, a little remote, does need to be on stage a lot, so to speak, a tendency toward excessive body focus, sometimes hypersexual, loud, interrupting. I think in America or in general, my sense is our perception of narcissists usually hinges on the version of exhibition or the arrogant one that you described.
Yes.
Is that your sense? Is that the fourth one gets the most heat? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I think that quite often people don't recognize it in the other types because that's not what's portrayed in film and movies and TV and, let's say, in the news media. It's usually exhibitionist. I'm bigger than you are.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Bigger, better, smarter, more entitled. There's no one else in the room. I mean, that's the one that kind of gets the most attention as far as in the dictionary photo under narcissism. But what I noticed was as you separated them into these other, well, ultimately 4 categories, but when you separated them into 4 and you brought in the whole idea that there's a version of the narcissistic pattern, the destructive one that is needy and hungry, because sometimes we don't know we don't have the clarity enough to be able to label it as such. And I don't mean label it violently. I just mean label it to the point where we can have some empowerment around it, bring some agency to the dynamic, which we'll get to in a second, which you teach so beautifully. But the needy, hungry one, the one that perhaps even comes across as the one that's always giving or serving, and yet somehow there's still an energetic pull toward them in a sort of self-absorbed way. That was a real revelation having read that in your books, because I kept thinking there was something wrong with me as usual. So I kept thinking, oh, this person's really wants attention and wants my love and wants my support. And I have been very susceptible to the sort of neediness around me caretaking. So for me to frame it as that being part of the destructive narcissistic pattern was really powerful and empowering for me. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. But one of the notions that I was trying to get across is that for this hungry category, when you think of grandiosity, you think of the exhibitionist. Mm. But the flip side of grandiosity is this impoverished ego, or the hungry one. And they both coexist. And so there is some sort of an exhibitionist in the hungry.
Right.
They are in your face. Mm. They are demanding. Yep. They want attention, but they get attention in a different way. Mm. And so that's what confuses us, is because we have this notion in our head that the narcissist is always on stage. The exhibitionist is always in your face, trying to get your attention. But what gets your attention? What gets your attention is somebody sitting in the corner suffering.
Right.
And letting you know in no uncertain terms, I'm suffering. Pay attention to me.
Right. Like
do something about my suffering.
Right. And that it's not, and it's our responsibility, right? So the susceptible creature across from this narcissistic pattern would sort of be seduced or pulled into that energy of, in this case, someone sitting across from me saying, if they're sulking or pouting or collapsing, they're all survival strategies of a kind. But if I'm particularly susceptible, which I have been most of my life, my tendency is to move over there and feel like I'm 100% responsible for this person's well-being, which of course is not even sane consciously on my part. But because the pattern has been in my bones for so long, I have to keep that in check, basically.
Yes. And the thing is we don't recognize it, and we can't describe it to somebody else. And if you were to describe that person to somebody else, they would look at you, why aren't you willing to help them?
Yes. And it's a little crazy making too, because, our self-perception is, or in my case, if my self-perception in that moment was, I am someone who helps, there's the part of the needy also goes into me feeling, bringing up feelings of guilt. And that's part of my susceptibility, is that I'm set up. We'll get into the contagion and the susceptibility conversation in a second more completely. But with the needy destructive narcissistic pattern, that's that pull and that sense that I'm responsible for you. And that's a big deal to highlight that as a pattern.
It is. And it's what is extremely frustrating, because you give and you give and you give, and you wonder why you feel as badly as you do, because you're acting on your own values and you're trying to help this person, but nothing works.
No.
That's the other piece. Nothing works.
No.
It never stops. It's never enough.
No.
It's never right. And so you keep wondering, what is it I'm not seeing, I'm not doing right? Why isn't this working?
Right.
And so we start blaming ourselves. And I would say sometimes we are very harsh on ourselves, because we don't recognize what it is we're facing.
Yeah, we feel that guilt and shame that somehow we're not rising to the occasion of quote unquote helping or saving or whatever. Whatever is impossible to do with the person across from us in that case. Yeah, I wrote a lyric, mind the empty bottle with the holes along the bottom. And I'm realizing now that it might have been about this pattern. So then there's a response, so what I've read and learned through you, and also through just my own personal experiences, we either comply, right? We either go along with it and dutifully attempt the perfectionism, trying hell or high water to rise to each occasion in a way that's almost set up to fail, or we rebel. So the compliant one is the one we were just describing, with the needy, hungry, impoverished version of the destructive narcissistic pattern. So that would be where I, in this case, might feel guilt-ridden, and then shame-filled, and just feeling like feeling ineffective, really, right? And then
yes, you do.
The rebellious one would be, if you were to rebel against the needy or hungry, would it just be sort of acting indifferent or a little detached, or just get
it
pissed
would be
off?
a lot that it would be a lot detached, and it could be a lot of anger because you really don't know where it's coming from. You only know that you don't want to get sucked into it, that it infuriates you and distresses you to try and meet their needs. And so what you do is you cut yourself off from that person as much as possible. And so you don't connect with them. And so the words and the demands just sort of bounce off of you, and you don't feel, or you've come to some point where you realize, I can't fulfill their needs, so I'm checking out.
Right. And the sad part to me is that the person at that critical juncture of checking out, because of how impossible the situation is set up to be, often they're the ones blamed for not helping anymore. It's like, wait a minute,
right.
This person actually has found a way to survive this. Now, it's maladaptive potentially in terms of functional relationship and relating. However, in this particular dynamic, it's actually a lifesaver in a way.
It is. And you described it beautifully, because this person is blamed. This person is seen as contributing to that person's distress, but this is the way that person has learned to survive. And unfortunately, while it might be appropriate for this relationship, what they have found is that they need to use it for every relationship. And so that impairs their ability to form meaningful and connected relationships, which we all need.
Yeah.
So yes, they protect themselves, but then they give up a lot.
They're disconnected in relationships, which is
to
me the biggest pain. The biggest hurt is that sense of disconnection. Another version, the second one, with the more kind of critical, prickly, the compliant response would be to just try to live up to the attacks or the perfectionism, or if one is being bullied, to try to be perfect, I would imagine, just to see what's being expected of them and to comply as best as possible. And then the rebellious response would be just to maybe go on the offensive first, like attack first, care a lot less, if at all, about pleasing others, maybe a little bit more almost hyper individuated, like just a solitary approach, like I don't need anybody, I don't need this person's approval, and going to the end of the extreme part of the continuum on that response. Can you tell me more about the prickly critical response, the compliant version, or the rebellious?
The prickly response is like you described. They go on the offensive because they think that, and they're right, a good offense, the best defense is a good offense. And so they try to and they try to prevent it. And what they're doing is, this is their way again of thriving, of protecting themselves. And the thing is that it doesn't look constructive to other people who don't understand what is happening,
right,
or what the relationship is with someone who has a destructive narcissistic pattern. They don't see it. They can't see it. And so the prickly person then is seen as the destructive one.
Right, because like the meanie.
Yes,
like
the
meanie. You're being mean, and really you're actually just trying to stay alive. And again, maladaptive and not great for relationality and intimacy and connection. But in that particular context, probably not an altogether silly survival strategy, really.
It isn't for that relationship. The difficulty, again, comes in differentiating between how to behave in one relationship and another. And then if you run into a number of these people with undeveloped narcissism to a great extent, you come to the conclusion, I need to keep this shield in place
with everybody
all the time until maybe, just maybe, I might meet somebody different. But so far, I haven't.
If we're still, I love how you use the word collaborating in some of your writing. Like if we're still susceptible, or we're still susceptible to the emotional contagion, we're collaborating in some way. And when I'm being really hard on myself, I'll outrightly say, I'm a magnet for this, or I caused this, or I go a little hyper responsible. Like if it weren't for this fluorescent light bulb sign on my head that says, please take advantage of my nature. So we'll get into a little bit more about how we can collaborate, quote unquote, less in these contexts, but let's keep going. Then there's the sort of conniving, manipulative, destructive narcissistic pattern. And the compliant response would be the child or the person across from attempting to ingratiate and kind of be sneaky. Tell me a little bit about the compliant response with the conniving, manipulative approach.
Well, this is with the compliant response, you find yourself being taken advantage of quite often. You also find yourself, particularly with the manipulative kind of narcissistic response, you find yourself doing things you don't want to do and even things that are against your values. So you stay in turmoil because you can't seem to say no, and people seem to be able to coerce, seduce, manipulate, con you into doing things that they want you to do that are not in your best interest, and you don't know how to stop that.
Welcome to the music industry. No, I mean, it pulls the receiver, for lack of a better term, pulls the person sitting across from the narcissistic pattern out of integrity in their own lives, out of their own value systems a lot. And even if we stay in our own value system, there's still that lovely guilt, that can be set up from the time that we're kids if we're subject or we're exposed to this kind of pattern as the norm, which so many of us are right now. It's so hard to watch.
Well, we are. Yeah, people are. And the thing is, it's hard to see it. Mm-hmm. It's hard to see in the moment that you're being scammed.
Yes. Well, tell me about it. Yes. No, my face is red and I'm looking down in shame. Yes. It's hard to see it, and it's so subtle, and that's why I'm really excited to be speaking with you about this, because the more the light is shined on this, I feel like the more empowered we can be around these, and we can catch the subtleties of dynamics that are dysfunctional, basically.
Yeah, dysfunctional, but and the other thing I'd like to point out is that, you can fool me once, but once you understand this, you're not going to do this to me again.
Right, once we know.
And we're going to see the pattern, and we're going to see it in other people so that we can prevent the same thing from happening with somebody else.
Yes. And the person who's behaving in a destructive narcissistic patterned way, they don't even know what they're doing. A lot of times it's outside of their conscious awareness, if not always. I'm curious your take on that. So for me, it's incumbent upon me as the receiver to be as equipped as I possibly can be so I can head it off at the pass.
I think you're absolutely right. They do not see it. This is the one thing that is kind of hard for all of us to take in, is that the person who has these troubling behaviors and attitudes, they're unaware. They can't see it. No amount of telling them will help them see it. They can't see it.
No. Lord knows I tried to show the mirror, and that was a very, very bad idea.
It's
not recommended.
No, you're right. Absolutely right, because it usually does not go well for you.
No.
It gets turned around on you.
Yeah.
And, essentially it makes you feel even worse about yourself than it did before you started.
Yes.
And so they can't see it. But I did want to interject that the flip side of that, or the other piece that I wanted to convey in my writings, is that just like they can't see those parts of themselves, so might we not be able to see our undeveloped narcissism.
Right. And anytime, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if it's, I'll come back in a second, but I think this is really important. Would you say anytime there is a dysfunctional version of narcissism on the continuum being evidenced in relationships, that all of it connotes an undeveloped narcissism, like even the destructive narcissistic pattern? Would you say that's undeveloped narcissism? All of it? The whole continuum, to the degree that it's dysfunctional?
I think it's kind of hard to say, but yes, I do. I think that if we could look at it as being undeveloped, then it wouldn't be so fixed a trait, and it wouldn't be so distressing to think that nothing will ever be done. I don't know of anything that can be done.
Right. And there's
but
different
I'd like
schools.
to think that there could be.
God bless the hope, because there's so many schools of thought out there. 99% of them, from what I've grokked and from my own personal experience, is that there is no hope, and it's a really resigned, sad place to be. I know some people who truly believe that there is a way to turn it around. many different approaches, like empathy can do it. But for the yeah. See, we've tried that one too, have we not?
Have we not? Yes.
I think so. We've tried them all. And then other people believe that, it's about developing the narcissism and having the person who's evidencing the pattern see that they have an effect on other people. But without the developed empathy, see, to me, narcissism or the destructive narcissistic pattern implies lack of access to empathy. I mean, that's the core sort of evidence for me when I know something is awry energetically in a dynamic, that there's a lack of emotional attunement and empathy.
There is, and I'm more power to all those people. I want to be with them to think that there is something you can do, and I want to help them find it. I really do. It's just at this point, I don't know of anything in the literature that shows us how to help that person change in a positive way. And one of the reasons is they do not see that there is anything wrong with them.
Right.
It's others.
Right.
You can't do anything with that.
No, I agree. So the rebellious response to the conniving and manipulative approach of the pattern would be that whoever's on the receiving end begins to sort of assume others are going to be taking advantage of us, or fearful of being coerced or seduced, maybe hypervigilant, on edge. And again, my thought is that the danger socially would be when you apply that to every single relationship, right?
It would be, and not being able to discern when it is let's say, a character trait, and when somebody might be doing it for another reason, but they don't do it all of the time. We can't know, and we can't tell. And so we get uneasy when we're in those kinds of situations. So we just cut ourselves off. And I think that's normal, I would say, but it isn't terribly helpful.
No. And it keeps the divide, it keeps the disconnection alive, which leads to anxiety, depression, a sense of meaningless hopelessness.
Yep.
Suicidality, all of it. I just feel like this is the original disconnective pattern. And then the last one, the fourth one, the grandstanding or the grandiosity with the exhibitionistic kind of approach in the narcissistic pattern. The compliant response would be to be sort of submissive and self-effacing, self-deprecating, maybe expecting the worst. And then kind of an obliteration of boundaries probably too, right? Like if there's no room for, dare I call it, the co-narcissist, if in a certain dynamic, if there's no room for them, easy for the self-esteem to be down, and a lack of boundaryfulness. Would you say that?
Yes.
Would you say
yes.
that? And then the rebellious response, just kind of being self-destructive, taking risks, having sort of this undercurrent of what I call punky behavior, or this hidden defiance, or just resistance to sharing feelings and thoughts and ideas. I relate to that one too. It becomes dangerous to share self.
Yes, it does. Yeah. And most people, or many people, I would say most people, are into protecting the self. And sometimes when they feel like the self is in danger, then they go into that mode of protection. And if you feel that way all of the time, then you stay in the mode of protecting the self.
And so people are interacting and they think that this is their personality, but it's really a character structure or a defense mechanism or a survival approach, really. And it's hard to access one's authentic self when we're mired, at this point probably neurochemically and everything. Everything's wired with this response, to comply or to rebel. And it's seen as our behavior and even our identity after a while. Like, this is who I just am. When people date, they're like, don't try to change me. And I'm convinced that most people don't actually want to change each other, although narcissism excluded, as though that's possible in today's age. I think people want to change any behavior that keeps one from disconnection. It's like people would say, in my past, I've had a tendency to, be, I'm a recovering love addict, etc. So in the past, I was unclear about what it was that I wanted to invite change around. And when someone isn't open to any of this conversation about growth and change and healing and correction and bonding, and healing attachment wounds, etc., the quick answer from this pattern, especially too, the narcissistic pattern, is to say, stop trying to change me. This is just who I am. This is just who I am. It's just, well, wait a minute. I actually don't think this pattern is who you are. So it's separating the defense mechanism from the core authentic person they are, but it's often impossible when the narcissistic behavior gets really extreme.
And besides, they don't know who they are.
Right. But what about I don't know if this term, you like this term, but what about the co-narcissist? What about
the person who's in a relationship with them?
Right.
I would say that if you're in any kind of relationship, whether it's with someone who has a destructive narcissistic pattern or not, that it's our job to appreciate the person as he or she is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about trying to change someone. If people do change, and they change in different ways, but the change should come from within that person, or the need to change should come from within that person, and it should be in response to something they want, not to some external pressure. Right. I'm talking about forming a meaningful and enduring relationship. You know, you've got to change along with your partner because we mature.
Yes.
Tastes change, behavior changes.
Haircuts change.
So yes, as often as I can. And and so, yeah, you want changes, but you don't want the kind of change that's imposed on the person.
Well, that's the outside-in version that isn't sustainable anyway. Even if someone tries it on for 10 minutes, it'll go right back, right?
Oh, they'll be resentful.
Right.
And that doesn't help the relationship. So I'm not so much in favor of anything that would suggest that an outside or another person changes another person.
Yeah, no, it's not possible. I've tried. Oh, yes.
It's hard enough working on yourself.
I know.
You can't go around trying to change others.
No. And speaking of that, it would seem that an antidote to this dynamic, and especially if someone has the destructive narcissistic pattern whom we love and whom we have no intention of severing the relationship with, that there's a few antidotes behaviorally and sort of nonverbal ways to approach being across from the destructive narcissistic pattern, as well as ways to develop a sense of self. There's this thought around being raised by or being affected by a culture, micro, macro, any of it, of narcissism, that one walks around with this emptiness or this hole in their soul or this hunger, this seemingly insatiable hunger. And for me, my sense is that it's this lack of development of self, because ideally in a good enough parenting context during the stages of development, we would have generally good attunement moments, emotional attunement, cognitive attunement, just attunement to the young child that's developing across from us. But if this narcissistic pattern comes into the style of parenting, how does a young child even develop a sense of self unless they do copious amounts of therapy later?
Well, it's best when you get what Winnicott calls good enough mothering. Mm-hmm. But that was way back there when we were thought that the only person who could be mothering or nurturing was the biological mother. What I think we have found now is that there are other people in our lives who can fulfill that. That maternal connection. That maternal nurturing. Yes. Attunement, and empathic responses. Right. Yeah, and empathic responding. Yes. And that's what a child needs. And so it's not all just the mother anymore. It's other significant and responsible adults in the child's life. So the child who doesn't get it, let's say from mother or from father, usually the other parent can balance it out, or a grandparent, or a teacher, another relative. And as we develop a teacher, mentor, coach, it's other significant people in our lives who can give us what that parent couldn't at the time. Yeah, the alloparenting movement too, the idea that it's not incumbent upon singularly the biological mom, although
although when you can, I would say go for it, of course, for the attachment. Yes. But if it's compromised in any way for whatever reasons, that the village and the community, in my mind, as always, can help with that attunement and help the stages of development of, attachment and exploration and identity creating and competency, building the capacity for competence, and all of those things can be mirrored and attuned to the emotional content behind the content of what's being said. That can be attuned to by all the significant people around us.
Yes, it can. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's not hopeless for the developing child.
Right. And if it's, and if there's a generally narcissistic climate that a child grew up in, there's the therapy, and then there's also the committed partnerships where so much healing can happen within that if there's some consciousness brought to the fact that we can often walk into relationships with a whole background of itches that weren't scratched, so to speak, during the stages of development, and so, some of the just sort of create a map or a vision for what's possible, sort of indications of healthy narcissism. One of them being sort of an indication of mutual respect and acceptance, and generally a positive regard in a mutual way. I mean, that's the key word, right? One way to recognize both people have a generally healthy sense of narcissism is that there's a mutuality.
That's right. I don't know if you could say that definitively, but let's say that's optimal, and that would be sort of the basis for which a deeper relationship could be built. But that mutuality and genuine caring for the other person, I think is critical, is crucial.
Yeah, which is the bedfellow of empathy too, right? So that is a key indication that there's some healthy narcissism going on. One of the things that can go away when being raised by perhaps or affected profoundly by the destructive narcissistic pattern is the loss of spontaneity and fun and playfulness, and to find the balance between fun and the spontaneity and a sense of responsibility too, because if there is another word that comes along with narcissism or the challenges around the destructive version of it with people, it's this searing lack of responsibility taking, the inability to self-reflect, cultivate that intrapersonal intelligence of being able to go in, a loved one across from me saying something that I was a blind spot for me, the capacity to be able to go to my room, journal, go to therapy, explore something, go within, feel my shame, push through it. That muscle of interiority, that muscle of being able to take responsibility, seems to fly out the window when the destructive narcissistic pattern takes hold. Would you say that's the case, the responsibility piece?
Would say that, I would say that's the case. You got to have both. I mean, it's nice to be flexible. It's nice to be spontaneous. It's nice to have fun. You also have to have that sense of responsibility, but that comes in with understanding the limits of your responsibility.
Right.
And how much you are responsible for yourself, and more important, what and how much are you responsible for somebody else?
And when someone's parentified, it's out of the gate, they're basically told, you young one, you're responsible for your parents or your guardians or everyone around you. And that was a big message that I got as a young person in different contexts. I just thought, wow, the harmony in this room I'm responsible for. And as a little creature, or frankly, as any aged creature, there's no limit to that. So what would you say to someone, me or anybody, if someone's just trying to develop limits around what they're responsible for, and if they usually go to an extreme?
If you usually go to extreme, I sympathize, but I also think that what has happened, and I don't want to offend anybody by saying this, but there's some grandiosity in that.
Like I'm needed, and it gives me power if I can affect
that
change.
You're the only one.
Right.
You're the only one that can fix it.
Right.
And that you must fix it. Well, rationally, that's not true.
No.
I mean, there are times when, yes, you do need to take charge and you do need to see to it that things are going well.
Right.
Like I do at Thanksgiving.
How big of you? I like when it turns to chaos myself. Just kidding. But yes, no, but the what you're saying, this is really important, not only for me to hear, but just for me to mark triply right now. So it was taught in a parentified environment that this little creature, or in my case, me, I am responsible for the harmony and all of these people's needs. So in some senses, it's like this tiny child, you know, how we're meaning-making machines on you know, triple fold as tiny creatures. So I just went, okay. And it does give a sense of grandiosity, but one that I was always really ambivalent about. It was like, okay, I'm important, I'm needed, I'm powerful, etc. But this feels very off.
It is off, and it isn't fair to give that to a child. But as an adult, we also can, as I say, go to our heads. And so when we start feeling like, oh, I must take care of this, oh, I am responsible, it's going to, am I?
Nice.
Is someone else that can take care of this?
Nice.
These are functioning adults. They can take care of themselves. Yeah, maybe I can help in some way, but it's not my responsibility. They are responsible. That's the part that's hard to get over, is the feeling that you are responsible.
Right.
Particularly if things don't go well. Now, do you feel responsible when things go well?
I feel collaboratively partly responsible. The humility definitely kicks in.
Yeah, well, there you go. You take responsibility both times.
Right. And attempt to do the moderate, like middle of the continuum, right? So that's a nice, actually, no?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm saying yes.
Was that an E of excitement? Yes. Okay, good. So the responsibility one, interesting in this moment, I'm realizing that if I can find a moderate sense of, quote unquote, taking credit when things go well in a more collaboratively minded way, then I can apply some of that collaborative mindedness to when things are disharmonious. And I can say we're still in this together, you know, because even in conflicts, this is all about conflict resolution and being semi-artful about it and being able to have a reparative and corrective experience, is to be able to, and sometimes I'll do this with my husband, which at times is helpful and times super obnoxious, but I'll just under my breath, like a child, I will say, you know, 80-20. i.e. it's 80% you, 20% me, or I'll just say this is 49-51, sorry. You know, or I'll just say this is 99-1 here. It depends on how open I am to taking responsibility, but something about getting mathematical about it has also been helpful. I don't know if that resonates with you, but one of the biggest challenges for me was to tell my body, you know, from in the trauma recovery journey, of tell my body that I'm not responsible for this, to control this chaos, or to fix this, or to help this, or to serve this, or to overgive. You know, so much of the effects of the destructive narcissistic pattern in our families of origin also lead to work addiction and substance abuse and depression and anxiety and actings out and suicide and all of it, because there's this lack of developed self, certainly, but there's also a lack of understanding of what responsibility is and how much of it to take in any given dynamic. So it's all set up to be confusing. And I thank you very much for swooping in and clarifying so much of this for us. Really, really grateful. And if you don't mind, I'm just continuing. Another indication of healthy narcissism would be the capacity to sort of discerningly trust, I would think, right? Like the capacity to know and maybe recognize in what context someone is warranted of trust, knowing that in some ways trust is earned, right, over time. Because what I notice, my susceptibility or my ability to suck up the emotional contagion, it looks in a way that I'm quick to trust people, and I don't always take a hot second and let trust be earned over time. What's your take on the whole healthy narcissism version of trust, or how to work our way there?
Well, I think, as you said, trust has to be earned. That doesn't mean that you go in to a relationship or an interaction immediately mistrusting. Mm-hmm. It means that you're willing to reserve judgment until you have evidence one way or the other. You need more information about whether or not this person can be trusted. Now, the other thing is that trust is not all or nothing. Some people can be trusted in one area and not so much in another.
Right.
I don't know if I can explain this very well, but let's just take a professional. Usually, a professional can be trusted to know what he or she is talking about in his or her field of expertise. And they're usually proud enough that they want to be accurate. And so you can, you can trust that. It might be that in commitment, in intimate relationships, they are not so trustworthy.
Right.
And then again, there could be somebody who is very good in intimate relationships, can't be trusted with money.
Right.
Or anything having financial. So it's not all or nothing. It's in this particular relationship, in the context, how much can this person be trusted?
Right.
And so I usually like to start with me. How much can I be trusted? And I need to trust myself before I can trust somebody else. And so I constantly work on understanding how I can be trusted.
Like what areas, you mean? Like what areas?
Well, what areas and to what extent. And I can be trusted to tell the truth in most instances, unless there's some reason for me not to tell you the truth. I mean, that's right. And remember now that telling the truth or not telling the truth is not necessarily lying. You could mislead, you could distort, you could withhold. So there are all kinds of ways of lying.
Yes, and manipulating.
Yes, and so it's not always clear cut, because we're thinking one thing and the other person may be thinking and acting on another piece of it or another definition.
Right. And so seeing the person across from you with, I mean, that mature quality, the development of self-maturation quality of being able to see a complex creature across from us, not sort of rigidly stuck into this hyper dualism that we're so obsessed with in America. We're winners or losers. We're better. We're worse. We're first place or we're nothing. You know, I just, like, my son and I are cracking up. He's 7 years old, and I have this voice that, you know, whenever I hear something or we see a billboard or something, and I'll just go, I'm better than everybody. I'm worse than everybody. It's just, this dualism is so intense. But this trust piece is really about what you just said so beautifully, is to be able to see in what context is this person trustworthy, and frankly, what context am I even interacting with this person? If I'm looking to trust someone in their ability to teach me how to do a backflip, I don't need to know that they can be trusted to put high nutrient vegetables in my soup, you know. So that sort of let it be distinct of areas to trust, and that just connotes maturity, which is amazing.
It is maturity, and it's not simple. And I think we've only touched on pieces of it, but we're trying to get across the idea that it's kind of complex, because I'm sitting here with my own understandings, and I'm talking to someone who has her own understandings, but we're talking to people that have all kinds of different understandings.
Yes.
And so
there'd be a reason to check, you know, like which is the next one, which is the emotional expression, our ability to be able to articulate in words feelings and to express ourselves. And even with regard in regards to what you were just saying, almost like asking sort of for direct markings of, you know, the name it to tame it, like, what are you feeling? I'm taking a guess here, and I'm going to check to see if that's accurate. Like, keeping the individuation and the boundaries and the respect of I and other distinct individuated human beings, sharing a sense of connection with on a soul level, but just being able to express ourselves emotionally. And I think it's a Mago clinical training where I remember one of the indications of maturity is being able to articulate our feelings, like putting our feelings into words is a measure of our grown-upness, you know. So with the trust, also it's the emotional expression. And you know, for a long time, I would spend time with mentors and teachers and people who were really able to articulate what they were feeling. And it was very inspiring to me, because as a younger person, I only had, you know, I feel sad, I feel scared, or I don't even feel entitled to feel scared. I'm counterphobic, you know. So another indication of healthy narcissism, or the middle of that spectrum, would be the ability to express our feelings and our emotions, would you say?
It would be both, two things. Having them.
Right. That
and
detail.
being able to express them.
Right.
Because some people can't access their emotions. They don't have them.
Right.
They have anger, they have fear, guilt, and shame. That's about it.
Wow. What stage of development does this destructive narcissistic pattern develop? Is it a pre-verbal? It starts pre-verbal, whether we go by Mahler or Piaget or Erik Erikson or John Bradshaw. Harville Hendricks has an amazing developmental chart in Keeping the Love You Find. What point does this pattern kind of get its mitts on you? Is it from egregious misattunement from day one? Like, when does this start and how can we prevent it?
Well, I wish I could answer that.
You have 5
It's a wonderful
seconds.
question.
You're like, let me clear my throat.
Yeah, 500 years, I'm not sure I can answer that.
It's all on you,
But
Nina.
I understand.
The future of our planet. I'm so sorry to pressure you.
And now here's a profound answer. I don't know.
I don't know. That's awesome.
There is some thought that a lot of these troubling behaviors and attitudes grow out of a lack of not receiving enough empathic responding during the developmental stage, and that is from birth on.
Okay.
And it's kind of hard. You know, I like to salute mothers, but you've got this infant who has had every need taken care of before being born, without having to ask or do anything. It was just taken care of.
Yes.
Now, all of a sudden, you're in this world where you've got to make your needs known. And mothers, many mothers, if not most, work hard at trying to anticipate the needs of the infant, which you can't do.
No. You can try.
So, yeah, you try.
Yeah.
You try really, really hard.
Yeah.
And that's why most parents do a pretty good job, is because they are trying. But if you think about infants and children who don't receive good enough empathic responding, and then they become the parentified child, then I think that that's a recipe for the undeveloped narcissism in adulthood. And that's why it's on a continuum.
So do you think that in the moment that rupture happens of the misattunement and the lack of empathic attunement, is it that there's a narcissistic wounding, certainly, but is it that there's no healthy narcissism? Part of what I want to do is neutralize the word narcissism, because there is a healthy version of it and a destructive pattern version of it, right?
It is. And I don't think it's in the moment. I think it's when it continues, it's a buildup. So no one empathic failure will result in this.
It's cumulative.
So it's being built up over time. It's many of these.
Yes.
The child is chronic. The developing child is not feel important, significant. And so they fail to develop along expected lines psychologically. And so it's not any one thing. It's a number of things through the years. Chronic
sort of egregious misattunements adding up over time it just can create disorganized attachment and anxious and ambivalent and and so as an adult, if one wants to be responsible, coming at it from either angle, the co-narcissist or the narcissist, I would see that in order to develop healthy narcissism, that there's several portals, and tell me which ones you agree with or add or subtract any of these. But I wrote a few down based on your teachings and me just dwelling on it as well, personally. Learning sort of appropriate amounts of empathy. So would you say that in general, I consider myself an empath. Would you say that empathy is also on a continuum, that there's, if you have the destructive narcissistic pattern, would you say to the left of the empath continuum that it would be 0 all the way to the full, almost quote unquote, overly empathic, can't walk into a mall, can't go anywhere? Some people would say it's a trait or it's an actual temperamental, physiological, biochemical ability. So when I hear appropriate amounts of empathy, I often feel a little lost, because I don't know if I've ever had appropriate amounts of empathy. It's really about trying to find that middle ground of what am I responsible for? Where is it inappropriate? how can I shut this off? I mean, there's so many ways to nurture and care for the empathic part, or quote unquote being an empath. But I would think that that would be something to cultivate or something to investigate if we want to develop healthier versions of narcissism.
If you want, well, you certainly would want people to learn to be empathic. I would start with teaching them how to make empathic responses. That maybe they aren't being empathic, but they certainly can understand the feelings that another person has and reflect those back to them. They don't have to feel them.
No?
No, they don't.
You can fake it to make it when you're learning empathy? First of all, you're implying that you can learn empathy, which is a really positive thing.
Well, it depends on how you define empathy. And yes, I think that there's such a thing in the literature that's called cognitive empathy.
Right.
And so it's not so much faking it as it is being
understanding
responsive, understanding of it and responsiveness. Now, you think about it. Do you want your surgeon to be empathic?
Not while she's cutting me up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I mean, no.
Yeah.
Not in the moment, maybe after.
Yeah. I want them to understand that it's going to hurt, that I am feeling this pain. And yeah, they know that I will be feeling that pain, but they're not detached from it. It's that they don't need to feel that in the moment to do their job. And they don't need to feel it later in order to do their job for somebody else. What they need to do is to understand and to, let's say, even sympathize with what I am experiencing. And the very act of not dismissing it as being unimportant or excessive is helpful.
I mean, the cognitive empathy, would that be maybe intellectually grokking it? Like, I can appreciate you're scared and I can appreciate this is challenging, but it wouldn't necessarily somatically in my body, I wouldn't necessarily be feeling those feelings.
You wouldn't be feeling it. And you wouldn't, and you could even say things, you wouldn't even have to say, I appreciate that you're scared. You could say something like, well, I can see that you're really scared, and I can see that you're having trouble getting your thoughts together, and just sort of describe what you see, which lets the person know that, yeah, you do understand I'm having these feelings.
Right.
But you don't necessarily have to have the same feelings yourself. That's very exhausting.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah, that's what you were saying, is that it really kind of wipes you out.
Yeah. I noticed the word that you used was see, like I can see this, as opposed to I use the word sense, like I'm sensing. Even sensing is more in the body, but seeing is something that you can kind of objectively, even with a sense of functional detachment, take in intellectually. Right. Mm-hmm. Any other versions of empathy? In cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, I would think. Any other versions?
Now, the emotional empathy, you certainly want your therapist to have.
Right.
Because I think
that could go badly if they didn't have
it. That's extremely helpful. But I don't know that it's all that helpful in everyday life, except with family, and especially with children, being able to understand and feel what they're experiencing. Yeah, to a certain extent, others outside of the family, friends, etc. But it's kind of exhausting, as I said before, to be feeling that much. So in terms of empathy in relationships, I would try for the connected or emotional empathy with those I'm close to. But those that I'm not close to,
keep it cognitive.
I probably would try to limit it to more of understanding what they are feeling in the moment.
And not going beyond that. That's a lovely version of a moderated or an appropriate amount of empathy, which is a big version of healthy narcissism, right? Being appropriately empathic.
Yes, it is. And see, it really helps people when they have to deal with very difficult people to not be that open,
right,
and have emotional empathy. They really need emotional shielding. so that they're not catching the feelings of other people and then, of course, acting on those and carrying them away and becoming distressed. So it doesn't mean you can't reach out and understand the other person.
Right.
It just means that you're protecting yourself from having to take on their feelings.
Yeah, you're alert to the emotional contagion, and you might, maybe not hardcore hypervigilance, but just alert to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So basically, healthy narcissism, being able to have a wide range of emotional expression, have a sense of concern and care for others, again, that is limited and moderate, self-care, self-focus, the whole development of a self, which we may have been, we haven't experienced if we had that egregious chronic misattunement. A lot of people ask me why because I'm obsessed with healing the rupture of self with self, self with other, self with spirit or God. And a lot of people have asked me, why spend all that time? Some have even gone as far as to say, why navel gaze to that degree? Because I know that as one develops a sense of self, or as I develop a sense of self, my immediate natural response is to see my connection with others and to serve, because I think there's a general erroneous thought that if one develops a mature, individuated, grown sense of self, that somehow they'll have a destructive narcissistic pattern established. But the opposite is the case in my experience.
Well, I think you're right. It's the opposite. That you will be not so much more in tune with yourself, but I think that helps, but you'll be in tune with others and with the universe.
Right. Amazing. And then so self-care, also being able to be separate, so individuated and distinct. I am separate and different from other people. Having a realistic sense of responsibility, also being expressed is a really big deal. To be responsible for that current of energy that moves through us and is expressed artistically, creatively, otherwise, in our kind of in the way our unique filters can express it. I find that keeps the narcissism kind of in check. My esteem kind of hovers around a nice moderate spot. Appropriate humor is another indication of healthy narcissism, and then willingness to be self-examining and self-reflective, self-corrective. I mean, just that humility piece. I tell my son a lot, the combination of being confident and humble. Both pockets, both shoulders have those little angels on both shoulders at any given time. And the last thing I'd like to end on, although I would love to talk with you about this for another 10 years with no breaks, there's a few ways, in loving the self-absorbed, there's a few ways that we can give non-verbally sort of keep boundaries with someone we're sitting across from who might have a destructive narcissistic pattern. Ones that have worked for me, if I'm in a work environment or in a extended family environment or anywhere where I need to sit across from this person, yet I want to remain intact. One is that I don't have full eye contact with them, is that I'll look at somewhere on their face or I'll look at the corner, which is so non-relational, but I don't get sucked in as much. I'm using very, very PhD terms here. I don't get sucked in. I
think it fits.
Yeah. So the eyeball where my eyes go is a big deal. Bringing someone else into the conversation, sometimes changing the topic. Every once in a while, I'll throw in a joke. There's just sort of creative, and it is slightly manipulative, but manipulative for good, in ways to kind of stop the contagion or stop me losing my sense of self across from someone who's exhibiting the destructive narcissistic pattern. Am I missing any off the top of your head?
Well, two.
Okay.
Two that I would recommend. One is not orienting your body to them, sort of turning your body away, just like you're not really looking them in the eye.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you can put something between you, it doesn't make any difference what it is. Piece of paper.
A big truck.
Magazine. A big truck. If you can manage it. A sofa pillow.
Nice. Your
but
purse.
any kind of barrier that will remind you to not take in their projections.
Right. That's huge. Rub a little stone, a little amethyst stone in the pocket. So body turned away, swivel that chair, eye contact, being careful, focusing. Anything else?
You can always take a bathroom break.
Oh, yeah, bathroom break. That has saved my life on multiple occasions. God bless those stalls. Well, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, Nina. This has been such an incredible dive with you. And thank you for how much, again, you've personally helped me and my family And thank you for all the people whose lives you've already touched. And hopefully today there will be one or two more who will be supported by your generous teachings. God bless you and thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. It's a joy to share these podcasts with you. I invite you to subscribe and join me on the next podcast. And until then, take care. I'll see you soon. Conventional kid, all intent.